Are we good?
Yeah, we're good.
Hey guys, it's Chris, the Natural Progressive. Guess what? I have on with me again one of my very, very favorite people, Derrick Jensen, author, activist, eco-philosopher. I recently listened to an interview he did with Sam Mitchell of Collapse Chronicles. And in the middle of it, they briefly brushed over um, defining violence. And I really wanted to hear more. So I invited Derrick to come back on and really go in depth. And I'm really going to let him lead the way on this conversation. And I'll probably pop in with questions. And at the very end, like 15 minutes to the hour, we'll probably accept questions. I do want them to be topical comments or questions. Put a C for a comment, a Q for a question, and try to direct them towards Oz. If you can tag him in that, please do. If not, put an emoji so it's easily seen, but wait until the last 15 minutes of this interview. Um, but in the meantime, I would very much like to offer my heartfelt welcome to Derrick Jensen on the topic of defining violence. So welcome, Derrick. Thank you for coming back.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I really am pleased and honored to always be on your program.
Thank you so much. This is your fifth time on with me, and I'm just so honored that you have been willing to come on that many times.
Well, your questions are great.
Well, thank you very much. So, do you want to briefly do an overview of the whole idea of defining violence? Because most people think about it as, murders, rape, um, you know, just basic violence against people, but they don't really think of it in a broader sense. And I really want to explore that with you.
Well, thank you. And our for being such an important topic, our discussions around violence are really squishy and poorly defined. And you'll hear people say, gosh, I'm against all forms of violence. And it doesn't really make any sense. Back in 2001 or two or something, I was having a phone conversation with this person who's a pacifist, and she said to me, I am against all forms of violence. And I said, really? How do you defecate? I mean, because every time you defecate, you kill bazillions of bacteria. And she said, don't be stupid. And I said, well, I'm not really being stupid because the problem is that, again, when we talk about violence, we just don't define it. So I've defined it, and I really like my definition. And people can have other definitions, and that's fine. But my definition is any act. We could also, I guess, have a discussion about what it means to have an act. Because if I stand by and do nothing while somebody does violence to you, I mean that is. I'm facilitating that violence by allowing it. But then we'll leave that aside for a second. So I define violence as any act that causes harm to another. And I really like this because it shows, this definition allows that violence is just a part of life. And so then I become really interested in what forms of violence. I think this is much more helpful to talk about what forms of violence we personally and socially find acceptable and not acceptable. Are you with me so far?
Yes, yes.
So,
I'm with you.
So, for example, most of us, under most circumstances, would define doing an act of violence to a carrot as socially and personally and morally acceptable.
Right.
Because a carrot is a living being too, and its life is as valuable to it as mine is to me and yours is to you. And most of us would define that as acceptable to eat a carrot. Don't have a problem with that, obviously. Correct. And most of us, under most circumstances, would define it as morally unacceptable to do an act of significant violence to a human being. And right. So my whole point on this is just that I think we have to have really important discussions about what forms of violence we do and don't find acceptable, both personally and socially. So, for example, obviously, this culture finds it acceptable to deforest an entire region in order to make money. Socially, that's acceptable. I would consider that an act of violence.
Me too. Yes.
And I think we need to have a discussion about specifically what forms we individually and we socially find acceptable. And I and one reason I'm so sticky on defining the term here is that I think it's really difficult to talk about any subject if we can't define the terms. If somebody says, oh, violence is bad, it's like, okay, what precisely do you mean? And what
Right.
precisely they mean is probably under most circumstances punching somebody in the face.
Or murdering or rape or, standard human violence. But there's so much more violence. But okay, this is what really got me thinking is when you're thinking about violence against, say, nature, that ultimately is violence against every other being on the planet when you're destroying the habitat, right?
Well, I would call it that. And see, we start getting into really interesting discussions then. And one of them is, and this was one of the premises of my book Endgame, is that we live in a we live in a rigid hierarchy that's not often spoken of. It's very specific, but it's not often talked about. And violence done by those higher on the hierarchy to those lower is nearly always invisible, or when it does happen, it's fully rationalized. And when violence happens from lower on the hierarchy to those higher, then it's met with shock, horror, and the fetishization of the victims. So
Right.
I
And you can see that in elites, like they do not get the same punishments as the lower levels of society. They get special treatment when it comes to like court systems and punishment and all that. I'm
well,
sorry, I'm don't mean to interrupt, but go.
no, no, that's absolutely true. And then it also happens across species
Yes,
that if,
I knew you would get to that point, so I was just bringing up the other parts.
if well, it's absolutely true too that rich people have an entirely different so-called justice system than poor people do. And like here's a great example is I got maybe, oh gosh, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, I got maybe 100 or 200 death threats within 1 week from the right wing. Usually it's anarchists who are sending me death threats, but for about 2 weeks it was right wingers, and it was because of one comment I made that got discovered by the Glenn Beck crowd, and they got really mad at it. And the one statement I made was that Tony Hayward, the CEO of British Petroleum, when it did the BP, the Deepwater Horizon explosion and spill, I said that he should be tried for murder, for killing the workers. And also, he should be tried for the destruction of the Gulf of Mexico. And if he's found guilty, he should be executed. I mean, he should
Right.
be a death penalty case. I mean, even if you don't care about non-humans, you still have the 7 or 8 workers who were blown up because they messed around with the safety equipment. They did not have good enough safety equipment in place. And
Correct. If it was a small business that was responsible for that many deaths, the people in charge would definitely be tried and convicted.
or what if it was some sort of terrorist?
Yeah.
I mean, if it were terrorists who blew up the oil well, they would have all been on federal death row. But because it was the CEO of a big company that blew it up, he was sentenced to a $36 million severance package.
Nice.
Um, and so that's, again, I want to talk about why is that not considered murder, what he did? And if you or I were to blow up 8 people, And I think, frankly, if you or I blew up 8 people, that there should be consequences against us too.
Correct. Yeah.
I'm not saying, see, that's the conversation. Why is it okay to blow up an oil rig because you're saving money and you mess up, but it's not okay to do it for other reasons? I mean, those are questions I think that we need to.
Oh yeah. Or what about the warmongers that are causing war and killing innocent civilians and the environment for nothing other than a resource like oil or gas or rare minerals. So
I don't disagree. And it's a really, one of the arguments that Hermann Goring, the Nazi, tried to make at the Nuremberg trials is that the only reason we're being prosecuted is because you won. And if there were, I mean, you're prosecuting us. One of the reasons he was prosecuted was because waging aggressive war. And he tried to make the defense, look at all the aggressive wars the United States has waged, or Britain. And they refused to allow him the defense. And I'm not saying they should have allowed him the defense. I'm just saying that there are, again, interesting discussions to be had that don't really work. Here's another problem, is that one of the books I'm working on right now is a book about stopping rape culture. And one of the things I'm doing is going through, Peggy Reeves Sanday studied rape cross-culturally. And she was trying to ask, why are some cultures high rape and some are low rape? And she found that there are some common denominators to high rape cultures. For example, if there's a male creator deity as opposed to a couple or a female creator deity, then it's more likely to be high rape, which is pretty interesting because when you think about it, it's kind of weird to have a male creator deity because life comes from women.
I agree. I can't disagree with that.
It's just kind of weird. You have to go through all sorts of gyrations to get there. And also, if it was highly militarized, it was a high rape culture. If it was, if child rearing practices were considered to be not very interesting or considered to be demeaned, that was a high rape culture, and on and on. A lot of things that you'd expect. And the thing I find really interesting, and one of the problems I'm going to have writing this book, and one of the things that's going to freak people out near the end of it, and I'm spoiling the end of the book here, is I'm going to go through how we can, like, how did it switch from being a female creator deity to a male creator? How did patriarchy emerge? I'm going to talk about that and what we can do about that. And then when I get to militarism, I'm going to go, we got some bad news, because this way of life, because if you want all the goodies that you have because of, if you want to have TVs and computers, you're going to end up having rape culture because you have to have a militarized culture, because how else do you get access to the resources that you need to make the TVs, to make the computers, to make the electrical grid? All of that requires a military system. Did we talk about the guy who interviewed me one time who was a dedicated Marxist who believed that you can have purely voluntary economic exchanges?
You brought that up, but please go into it again.
Okay, well,
because not everyone's seen all the interviews. So
okay, well, I can't believe they don't watch you every week.
I know, right? Well, some do. I have quite a loyal audience that watches me every week, but so there's some that don't. So
this guy was interviewing me, and he was a dedicated Marxist who believes that it's possible to have an entire industrial system that's based on purely voluntary exchanges. And I said, do you have cities in this? And he said, yeah. I said, great. So how do you get around the city? And he said, buses. I said, great. What are the buses made of? He said, metal. I said, great. Where do you get the metal? He said, mines. I said, great. How do you get people to go in mines? He said, well, you pay them a lot. And I said, well, mining is really one of the original forms of slavery, but I'll give you that. I mean, nobody wants to live their life underground, but I'll give it to you. And and then I said, but what about every hard rock mine in the world pollutes rivers? So what about the people who live next to the river? What about them? He said, well, you just pay them to move. I said, what if they've lived there for 5,000 years and they don't want to move? He said, you pay them more. I said, look, what if they're ancestors are buried there, and they refuse to move no matter how much you pay them. And he said, well, in that case, how many of them are there? And I said, I don't know. What difference does it make? 500? He said, well, the million people in the city vote, and they vote that the 500 people by the river have to leave. And I said, so what you've done is you've gone from purely voluntary exchanges to democratic empire, land theft from indigenous people, and genocide and ecocide within less than a minute, all so you can have a bus. And the point is that this is another form of violence that we don't talk about, or we don't think about. We don't think about the violence that's necessary at every step of the way to bring these items to us. To bring, where did the materials for this couch come from? What were involved in all those petrochemicals, the fabrics?
Everything came from nature. Everything we buy, everything we use comes from nature. And at some point in the whole production process. So yeah.
And that's exactly it. That's why also I can't say that I am against all forms of violence, because mountain lions have to eat.
So do humans, so do other animals. Yeah.
So do deer, so does everybody. And that's, there's a photograph that I took this summer that I just love. It's of a pile about this big of bear poop that is in the middle of the forest, and it's surrounded by duff, and so it's just all the redwood needles are all over the ground, and then a black pile of poop with all sorts of grass coming out of the bear poop. And I love that, because that's really all of life right there. The grass fed the bear, or you can say the bear ate the grass, doesn't matter. The bear ate the grass, and then in exchange for the nourishment, the bear carried these grass seeds in its gut and then pooped them and planted new seeds. And
right, and deer do that, and rabbits do that, and all kinds of species do that. So
exactly, and that's what.
But humans don't do that. It goes into a sewer and destroys everything.
Well, that's a big thing too, because I think about this, and I know this is kind of corny in some senses, but it's not in others. There's a lot of berries where I live now. It's pretty interesting. Until I moved to California, I never liked berries, because the only berries I ever had were in a grocery store, and they don't really taste that good. But living here, I've eaten blueberries and blackberries just straight off the vine, and they're delicious.
Pacific Northwest is famous for their wonderful berries.
Yeah, I've discovered that. And the point is, every time I eat a berry, I feel like I'm not fulfilling my end of the bargain, because I'm eating the berries and I'm pooping inside. And the reason that they're feeding me, the reason the berries are giving this to me, is not because they like me particularly, although maybe they do. The reason they're giving me the berries is so that I can carry those berries, the seeds, inside my body and then poop them out, which is a brilliant arrangement, no matter whether
it's because it's fertilizer and
everything in one package. It's just brilliant.
Yes, it is brilliant. It is brilliant. Yeah, no, I think about these things too. That's why it's so creepy. But I'm weird, and I'm sure people consider you weird sometimes too. Like, it's like they're not thinking the natural process and how we were designed.
My point on bringing this back to violence is that, salmon swim up a river and then they're going to die. They die after the Pacific salmon die after they spawn. And a lot of them get eaten by bears, or they get eaten by eagles, or they get eaten by somebody. And then one of the purposes of a salmon, and I have a problem with the word purpose, because of course they have lives that are, valuable and unique to themselves. But one of their ecological purposes is to carry tremendous amounts of nutrients up into the forest. And then those nutrients have to be spread out somehow. And so
the bears do that.
Yeah, bears do it.
Yeah.
Ravens,
eagles, hawks,
everybody.
Yeah.
And so that's one reason that I want to demystify the word violence, because it is definitely violence when a bear grabs a salmon and bites its head off, or bites and eats the guts out. That's definitely violence. I'm not in any way suggesting it isn't.
But
But
isn't that more of a purpose though? Give like a life form that existed, had a life, and then passed away and became nourishment to another life form and created more life through soil, building up the soil or anything like that. Um, I'm kind of getting off my train of thought, but it's just like humans don't do that. I mean, some people do, but other people like um they bury themselves and they get embalmed in chemicals, and then they don't become part of this natural process, and I think that's violence. I mean, there's so many definitions that you can attach to it when you really think about it.
exactly, and that I get frustrated sometimes because I I wanted to start a discussion with this question of what is violence, and how, what forms are socially acceptable, personally acceptable, etc. And then somehow, simply because I raised it, I get pegged as the violence guy, as somebody who's advocating violence. And this is completely untrue. What I'm advocating
I don't see that.
is we open the discussion to talk about all these different forms. I mean, because nobody can say that with a healthy run of salmon, bears eating the salmon and then pooping in the forest and helping the trees there with their poop, nobody can say that I mean, nobody should be against that.
Right, it's a natural process. it's
Yeah, but it
it's
is,
how the ecosystem works together, how the different species work together.
yeah, but it is violent. I mean, from the perspective of that particular salmon, thank you very much. I would rather not get eaten by a bear and instead have sex and then die, you
But
know?
it's a short-lived violence, unlike the civilization violence that's imposed on everyday people who are starving to death, who don't have housing. I mean, there's you can go off on that direction as well as far as violence goes.
That's a huge question too, is what about structural or institutional violence? And when we think about violence, again, we think about somebody punching somebody in the face, doing it individually. And what about I don't remember the numbers right now, but there are tens of millions of people worldwide who have been driven off their land because of dams, because the land was inundated.
Mhm. I've
Happened.
seen that happen here in this state. Yeah.
And why is that not considered a form of violence? And it comes back to that premise that I mentioned about violence done by those higher on the hierarchy to those lower is often invisible. If it serves the economic system, then oftentimes it's not considered violence. And likewise, if the United States bombs somebody, well, that's bringing freedom and democracy to the country. And if somebody else bombs somebody, that's violence. And so,
Right.
and that's again why I want to. I mean, I don't even have a problem in all circumstances with violence against human beings. I mean, if somebody breaks into my home and they are trying to harm someone I love, that's still violence. If I shoot them in the head, that is violence. But I don't have a problem with it.
Well, there's justified violence and there's unjustified violence. A lot of times, unjustified violence happens against people or beings on this planet that have done nothing wrong, have not contributed to bad situations. In fact, they're contributing to good,
The,
and they just get destroyed anyway because it gets in the way of the elites and
problem,
people of greater power. So
the problem is I don't disagree with you. The problem is that basically all violence is justified from the perspective of the person perpetrating it.
mhm.
People generally act everybody has their behavior rationalized. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I have never once in my life been a jerk. Every time I have,
Every time I've been a jerk, I've been justified for being a jerk.
exactly, exactly. And this is true on the biggest scale too. Robert J. Lifton talks about how before you can commit any mass atrocity, you have to convince yourself that what you're doing is not harmful, but instead a positive good. And it's really interesting. He did that studying the Holocaust, the capital H Holocaust.
Mhm.
It's really interesting to read because he's brilliant. And it's interesting to read the, the, the work he put together about the justifications that the Nazis used to declare themselves the real victims. And
Yep.
at every step of the way, I'm not saying that they were the real victims. I'm not saying that at all.
No, I know you're not saying that, but they made put that in their head to
But
allow it to happen with propaganda and everything. Like they
there
were
was,
the victims,
there's
and
this
the Jewish people, like the immigrants are now, they're the perpetrators, not the victims.
there was
So
this
yeah,
great speech given by, I don't remember who, it was some higher up Nazi, but it wasn't Hitler. Some higher up Nazi talking about you have to bear, he was speaking to the people who were going to be committing the mass murder and genocide. You have to, this is a burden you have to bear that will be so basically beloved by history. But for now, you have to do this very, very, very difficult thing. And what he was doing is he was making them the victims and heroic for doing this terrible thing, which didn't completely work, by the way, because the rates of alcoholism among those perpetrating the capital H Holocaust were through the roof. Because no matter how much rationalization you have, it still takes a psychic toll on you to be
I
gassed.
can imagine. Yeah.
But anyway, back to the definition of violence. Another part of the problem with our squishy definition of violence is that so often, and we're seeing this right now enacted in law, we're seeing it all the time enacted in law, so often the property of those higher on the hierarchy is worth more than the lives of those below. And if someone below in the hierarchy destroys property of somebody above, then that is talked about as violence. And I mean, that I'm not suggesting that under all circumstances it's okay to go in and steal from somebody else. I've been burglarized, and it does feel like a violation. Um, but that doesn't alter the fact that on a social level, it is set up so that if somebody these days, I mean, they're increasingly criminalizing protesting pipelines. And if you protest the putting in of a pipeline, that has been considered by some to be violence or terrorism. And it's the same with when people go into factory farms and document the horrors that are perpetrated on the
Yeah. They've
human.
made that illegal. Like in the state, it's illegal to um, photograph or videotape what happens on farms here because people did that and then got PETA all involved in not I am not a proponent of PETA, mind you. PETA goes a little too far and they really put a bad name on people who really care about the environment and animals. They really go too far. But no, but they made it illegal here in Utah to document anything from factory farms.
And that's happening all over. And
Mm-hmm.
it's often considered, I've heard them throw out the language terrorism. Oh, I got a great example. This is, oh gosh, it's old, but it's 15 years old, but it still cracks me up that, down in Napa Valley, there's a lot of wine vineyards. And one of the pests for vineyards is called the glassy winged sharpshooter. It's a little insect and it sucks the sap of vines. And the newspapers were describing the uh, the insects as terrorists.
What? An
And
insect is a terrorist?
I mean, that's because they were destroying the monetary value of people in power. The language just gets thrown out everywhere.
Oh, and that's why they go. Okay, so I was listening to Last Born in the Wilderness. I don't know if you've heard of this blogger, but he talks a lot about things like that, like invasive species, what they call invasive species. Invasive species is basically any species that gets in the way of human activity that makes it less valuable to humans. That's what they're considering invasive species. So even if it's a natural thing that nature says, okay, well, you can thrive here, they want to get rid of it because it's not valuable in any way to humans, and it may attack something that is valuable to humans. So that's another. Can you speak on that a little bit, maybe, and give
Well,
your opinion?
I don't actually agree with that entirely. I think that's
Okay.
certainly true sometimes. For example, sweet clover is not considered an invasive species by some because it doesn't have harmful economic effects. And it is just as non-native to the United States as some other species are. The problem I have is that there are circumstances in which invasive species cause tremendous harm to the natural world. I
Yeah,
don't
I can see that.
I
But
don't
people making it their economic value, like, or destruction of economic value instead of considering the natural world.
yeah,
And what's better for that is my problem with it. Just want to clarify that before you go on. Go on.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, absolutely. I completely agree that I'm glad when you have an invasive species that destroys an economic product like vineyard monocrops, because monocrops are, in those cases, what the invasive species are quite often doing is attempting to bring bring back some balance because nature hates a monocrop, and you see this all over. The problem is that there are other times, chestnut blight is a great example. Dutch elm disease, um, chytrid is a great example of an invasive fungus that is causing untold harm to amphibians around the world. And um, I think the place where I would agree with those who are strongly uh, who don't have a problem with invasive species, the place where I would end up agreeing with them is that usually money goes to stop an invasive species when it is harming economic interests,
Yes,
and
that's the point I was trying to make. Yes.
the amount of money that is spent stopping chytrid is trivial compared to what would be put on things that are causing um, well this
Destruction of natural, like,
yeah, and this brings
species
up
that
an
live
issue
there.
too, that another reason I have a problem with just saying violence is bad is that we can it lets people off the hook for inaction. But so long as dams stand, we are you don't have a morally pure position saying I'm not committing an act of violence because you don't take down a dam, because the dams are actively killing salmon. Or another example, and I don't want to get in a fight with this with anybody. I'm just I have a perspective, people are going to have different perspectives, that some people get really, really mad when they talk about removing, for example, rats or killing rats on an island that didn't evolve with rats. And I actually don't have a problem with killing the rats on that island to save the seabirds. And a great example of a successful one of those is back in the 40s or whenever, some idiot put in some fox farms on some Aleutian Islands. And that's unforgivable. And the person should not have put the fox farms in. And they did. And some of the foxes got out. And fox farms shouldn't exist anyway, but leave that aside. Foxes got out and they uh, devastated the Aleutian goose population. Aleutian geese are really extraordinary creatures. They look like Canada geese, except they're a little bit smaller. And they're really extraordinary because they fly nonstop from the Aleutian Islands down to islands off the coast of California every fall and then back up in the spring. It's 2 weeks of flying nonstop. They lose 25% of their body weight when they fly, and they sleep while they fly, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, the foxes were decimating them. So they wiped out the foxes on a couple islands, and the Aleutian geese were able to come back. And um, the point is that it is an act of violence to kill those foxes. And to not kill those foxes would have doomed the Aleutian goose to extinction. And so,
Okay.
again, I'm not interested in simply saying violence is bad under all circumstances. What I'm interested in is talking about when that's acceptable and when it's not
Right.
acceptable. And it's fine for people to think that's not acceptable, but those are discussions we need to have both personally and socially. That's all I'm saying.
Absolutely. I agree with you so much. It's almost a question period, but I want to ask you one question. So in our circumstance where I live, we have foxes, and the foxes have been run out of their natural world. They've been kind of pushed into backyards. So say we had a whole bunch of ducks. So the foxes came in and ate all of our ducks. I personally feel horrible about the us taking over the foxes' land. And when we called wildlife resources or whatever, they said, well, yeah, we you can trap the foxes, but you have to kill them. And but we're on their land. It's like it's so weird when we're taking over the environment of another species, the habitat of another species, it's fine, to kill them. But humans are the hugest, biggest invasive species on the planet, and we're invading
Yeah, I,
all territories. So,
I completely agree. And you'll note that the example I used was about foxes, was about non-native foxes
mhm.
killing an endangered species. It was not about native or non-native foxes killing chickens or ducks. That this happens quite often. I hear about this fairly often. That grizzly bears, which are endangered, who are an endangered species, will get killed because they killed some chickens. And I think that's
Mhm.
absurd. Um, I loved when I lived in Spokane. I had chickens and ducks, and I loved them. And there were coyotes, and I had to figure out how do I negotiate a relationship living in coyote territory, living in their home. How do I negotiate this relationship? And what I ended up doing is um, make two things. One is I fenced off. I didn't want to fence in the chickens and ducks, in part because they fly over the fence anyway. But what I did was I fenced off the land with a chicken wire fence uh,
Mhm.
around to the side where the coyotes usually came from. And basically, and then I did two things. And I also said to the fox to the coyotes, I'll make you a deal. I will take you food out there every day or two in exchange for you not killing the chickens. And for the most part, they kept the deal better than I did. But the other part of the deal was basically I said to the chickens and ducks and turkeys and everybody else, okay, so if you go around the fence out to the other place, then you're on your own. And if you stay near the house, then the coyotes probably aren't going to come up. And that worked more or less. Anyway, so the point is that if you're going, I have no patience for people who live in bear territory or coyote territory or wolf territory. And then you get upset when the wolves or coyotes or bears do what wolves or coyotes or bears do. I mean, you're in their home. So,
Right. Yeah. No, I agree with that fully. It's hard for me because I love my ducks, and when they all got eaten by the foxes, I never thought of feeding them. So it's like maybe if I fed them, I wouldn't have that problem.
well,
Uh,
if you do it, don't be stupid and do what I did at first, which is I started feeding them close to where I kept the chickens, which is just incredibly stupid because all
no, I'd feed them clear at the back side where they don't.
yeah, take it a long ways away. I ended up feeding them maybe a quarter mile away.
Hmm.
Like that worked better, but I can't believe how stupid I was at first to feed them. That'd be like, I don't know, like
Hmm.
giving somebody an ice cream cone that's 6 inches away from the big container of ice cream and expecting them not to eat more. I don't know, it's a terrible example, but
No, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, absolutely. Um, absolutely. I think we're about at question time. If anyone has any questions, please keep them topical because last time people got out on a rail and I'm not dealing with that this time. Um, but yeah, if there's no, you can keep talking till there's questions. Oz should be watching for them. It's hard for me to pay attention to that and to give you your proper attention, Derrick. I
well,
really love this topic, and I knew it could take a whole hour just
well,
talking about this.
I wrote my book Endgame about this, and Endgame is two
Mhm.
volumes, 1,200 pages total.
Mhm.
Each one's
So
five, six
easy.
hundred pages. It's a huge topic, and I think it's one
Hmm.
of the most important topics there is. There are most important topics that exist.
I
Um,
think so. Yeah.
because
That's-
clearly, this culture thinks it's okay to kill the planet.
mhm.
I think that is the most violent thing you can do.
I agree. Absolutely.
And also, and I don't want to derail this into the whole death penalty thing. I really don't want to go there. The, I do want to say one thing, which is there are people who say that I understand saying you're opposed to the death penalty because you're opposed to the state killing someone, but there are people who say they're opposed to the death penalty because they're opposed to the state committing violence. And that's kind of silly because how do you think you get them in prison? I mean, they go to prison at the point of a gun. So my point is simply that just because you're not putting a needle in somebody's arm, that doesn't mean that you're not committing an act of violence against them. You are, and holding them in prison, that's a whole different discussion whether it's acceptable with somebody in prison. But that itself is an act of violence.
No, I totally agree with you. My only problem with capital punishment is the percent they have it wrong and innocent people end up, and it's usually the people of color that end up being the ones that they're wrong about. That's my only problem. I have no problem with people you absolutely know are guilty of horrible atrocities. I have no problem with that.
Well, I would. Another problem I have, yes, I agree. And an additional problem I have with it is that it doesn't apply to people like Tony Hayward of BP. That
Oh yeah, how about George Bush or Hillary Clinton? All these people that are really guilty of atrocities, of war crimes, of killing innocent civilians.
yeah,
Okay, there's
okay,
that. I don't mean to get political, but you know,
okay,
politicians, the elite that are guilty of atrocities against beings and
right,
and the environment for
right.
what they've done.
I
So
completely agree. So there's a big thing here. Is that a question for me?
yes, it is. So Oz says, you could put it up on the screen, Oz. Is term violence, I'm assuming that the term violence, weaponized to serve the agenda of any human to achieve their desire to profit off of another species or humans means of survival in their existence in their perceived reality.
Well, that's the entire topic we're talking about today. That's the whole
Mhm,
point, is that it can be weaponized so that
mhm.
if somebody does something you don't like, that's considered violence. But if you do it, that's a means to an end. And and that's what I'm trying to do by broadening out the term violence to include any act that does harm to another, because then we can start figuring out which when we are using this as a uh, when we're weaponizing. I love your use of the term weaponizing. We can figure out when we're weaponizing the term and when we're not, and just actually talking about reality. Because I
That's
think
awesome.
saying that a bird just ate a grasshopper and that was an act of violence against the grasshopper, under my generic definition, that's not weaponizing the term. That's just describing what happened.
Right.
Um, and I think from the grasshopper's perspective, the grasshopper would agree. Um, and then again, we enter into those discussions. Okay, should I go for the next question?
Yes, yes. So Oz Gary, I'm gonna destroy this. Your Yorovsky, the Jewish vegan activist, calls factory farming a modern Holocaust. Animal slaves put to death in a style even worse than the final solution, gas chambers. So do you know of him?
I do know of him. I don't think we've ever met. Um, so is that the question of do I know of him or do
Do you know of him? What do you think of him if you know him? Or what do you think of that whole concept of factory farming, a modern holocaust against animals?
I don't disagree that factory farms are one of the worst.
Mhm.
There's a line I read in a book when I was a teenager that's always stuck with me, which is if animals could conceive of a devil, his image would be man's. And I don't agree with it entirely because I think animals can conceive of a devil, and I think his image is industrial human beings. And um, so I, I, I wrote in Culture Make Believe about how every Holocaust is different and every Holocaust shares some commonalities. And the Holocaust of the American Indians was different than the Holocaust of the European Jews and
Agree.
share some similarities. And the I don't have a problem with using the word Holocaust against the victims of factory farming, and it shares commonalities with uh, with the European Holocaust, and there are differences with the German Holocaust. And one of the things that it shares that I think is really important is the mechanization of death and the mechanization of violence, the outsourcing of violence to machines,
Yes,
the
yes.
um, the conversion of a face-to-face, remarkably intimate, but which I'm not meaning sexual, I'm meaning very to kill another being,
Yeah, that you knew, like you raised it, you knew it, and then you had to kill it for substance
or even if you
would
didn't
be
know
so
it, even
difficult, or even just in the wild,
yeah,
same
like a
thing.
mountain lion killing a deer is still it's a again not sexual at all, but is a remarkably close act.
Mhm.
It's it brings them into close contact,
Or you're just buying meat at the store, you don't see the violence that's happening in order to get that meat
and
to the
even if you're
table.
in a slaughterhouse, it's mechanized as much as possible, and it is rationalized, by which
Mhm.
I don't mean you've justified it, but by which I mean you've made the entire thing economically efficient.
Mhm.
And that's one of the take home lessons from the capital H Holocaust is that a bureaucracy, and Lewis Mumford talked about this extensively. I think, and I get this from Lewis Mumford, that a bureaucratic organization is the most important invention of humans in terms of the way the society works. And the reason this is really important is because if you create a bureaucratic organization, it doesn't matter whether you are putting Jews on cattle cars to take them to a place where they'll be gassed, or putting pigs on trucks to take them to a place where they'll be slaughtered, or putting trees on log trucks to take them to a sawmill. The same bureaucratic organization, from the perspective of a trucker, it doesn't matter what you're hauling. And one of the things Robert J. Lifton talked about is that was this Raoul Wallenberg. Anyway, somebody talked about the Holocaust. Most of the people who participated in the Holocaust did not shoot Jews face to face. What they did is answer telephones, write memos, and that's the genius of the corporate or bureaucratic organization, is that it diffuses responsibility for atrocity, and uh, And it allows us to distance ourselves. I remember years ago, and somebody told me about hunting, that a lot of indigenous people would have rituals before they would go hunting because nobody can kill in their right mind. And there
Mhm.
has to be purification before you go and when you come back. Because
And they thank the animal
and because
for giving them substance. And it was not a happy thing. It was kind of sad.
Joseph Campbell talked um, about the recognition that we die, and the recognition that through eating we kill, no matter no matter who we're killing. But he thought that was the beginning of religion. Um, anyway, so short answer to the question is that yes, I think that there are similarities between them, especially one of the most dangerous ones is the fact that it mechanizes death, which should never be mechanized.
Right. I agree 100% with you on that one. So we have another question.
Okay,
I know you can go forever on questions, and I love that about you. So this is from Beatrix
time.
Kid Video. Thank you. Welcome to the show. I haven't seen you comment before, so welcome. What's Derrick's vision for a way of life? Go back to homesteading ways, indigenous ways, nomadic ways. Might be a non-issue if we're headed for social class. What do you think?
Well, a couple things. One of them is I just had an idea, which is next time you have me on, why don't we just go to questions right away?
Yeah, so we could just do a question and answer video. That'd be fabulous.
Okay, let's do that next time. Okay,
Okay,
so
absolutely.
this question, um, I think that given that we're headed for social collapse, I think the question is even more important. And I think first that my vision for a way of life is based on what is possible and what is realistic, by which I don't mean socially realistic, but what I mean is ecologically realistic. And what I mean by that is, gosh, 25 years ago now, I was riding, God, 28 years ago, God, I'm getting old. Anyway, I was riding in a car with a friend of mine, George Drappin, and we got stuck in traffic. And I'm just making conversation. I say, so George, if you could live in any level of technology, what would it be? And George was not in a very good mood. And he said, Derrick, that's a really stupid question. Because we can fantasize whatever we want, but the truth is there's only one level of technology that's sustainable, and that's the Stone Age. And we'll be living there again someday, or we won't be living at all. And the only question is what's left of the world when we get there. And the reason this is really important is because the Tolowa lived where I live now for at least 12,500 years, Tolowa Indians, for at least 12,500 years. And they didn't destroy the place. And the dominant culture has been here for 180 years, and the place is trashed. And how was it that they were able to live here for 12,500 years? And, excuse me, part of it is that any way of life that's based on the use of non-renewable resources won't last. Because if you are using up non-renewable resources, they're eventually going to go away. It doesn't matter how much oil there is. If you're using it, eventually you run out. And also, any way of life that's based on the hyper-exploitation of renewable resources won't last. So if there's 1 million salmon in the river, and the next year there's 900,000, and the year after there's 800,000, and the year after that there's 700,000, eventually there won't be any. And the only way you can live sustainably is by actually helping the land where you live, as opposed to harming the land where you live. And so that's my vision for how to live, is living in a way that helps the land. And there's one more part of this, which is that so many Indians have said to me that the primary difference between Western and indigenous ways of being is that even the most open-minded Westerners perceive the world as consisting of resources, as opposed to other beings to enter into a relationship with. So I would say any way of life that's based on the resourcification of others is not sustainable. Because if you perceive the world as consisting of trees, as consisting of dollars on the stump, that's how you'll treat them. And instead of treating them as neighbors, And doesn't mean that we all have to like our neighbors all the time. As we mentioned at the beginning of the show, or before the show started, a friend of mine was here, excuse me, pounding some 2x4s on the outside of one of my windows because the bears are scraping at the house. And I love the bears, but sometimes they piss me off and I run out and I yell at them and tell them to go away. And, you know, I'm sure sometimes they wish they could yell at humans and tell us to go away too.
I'm
And
sure. Absolutely.
anyway, so that's my vision for a way of life is to ask ourselves, what can the land support? And
And how can we live in cooperation with it instead of using it as a resource?
exactly.
Yes. God, that's why I love you so much. It's fabulous.
Well,
I don't know what human he has a question, but I'm not sure how to even he's like, what question is he looking for? I don't know. But okay, I don't know if that's an actual question, human. Really? I don't understand your question.
Yeah, a couple of these questions are kind of vague. They're assuming that people already have the information that Derek is offering. But my question to that would be, how do you know that everybody has this information when we've got a guest like Derek in his special area? So, more that said, a more articulated question would be helpful to me as far as picking them. Andre is
Yes,
pretty
please.
pretty specific. He's looking for
Specific?
some solutions. Yeah, so specific solutions. Derek, do you have any
Do you
specific
have any,
solutions?
yeah, Andre, thank you for your question. Any specific solutions? Although, I mean, I'm thinking you're saying the same thing as me. It's like live in cooperation with nature and not against it. But um
I'm a big
uh,
fan. I have a good friend who's a doctor, and he always says that proper diagnosis is the first step toward correct treatment.
mhm.
When people ask for solutions, I'm not saying Andre was saying this at all, but a lot of times when people ask me for solutions, they're saying, what solutions do you have that make it so we can keep industrial civilization and have a planet? I'm not saying you were saying that. I'm saying that that's what they say a lot of times. They get really frustrated with me because people will say, okay, how can we save the salmon? And they'll make solutions like shoot sea lions or stuff like that. But the truth is, the way you save salmon is to stop industrial logging because salmon require forests, to stop industrial fishing because the salmon on the Columbia were getting hammered even before the dams went in by the commercial fisheries,
Stop building dams.
and then stop dams, take out dams, and then stop the global warming because they require cold water, and then stop the murder of the oceans because they can't survive without living oceans. So how if you don't do all of those, then salmon won't survive. So my solution is to remove dams, stop industrial logging, stop industrial fishing, et cetera, et cetera. And then they say, well, that's no solution. To which I say, um, the solution is to recognize that the health of the planet is more important than any social system.
Right. Any more important than our comfort level, more important than our
Yeah,
computers
the
and are
electricity.
able to build and rape the earth more. Okay, finish your thought, and then I want to bring up one more thing before you go.
Okay. Um, oh, just that once you make your loyalty to the natural world as opposed to the economic system, things become really much more clear. For example, and I'm sure I've said this before on here,
Mhm.
it's all the time. If space aliens were doing to the planet what the dominant culture was doing, we would know how to resist. We would have different solutions than we do when it's the culture to which we pledged allegiance. It's like, we talked about factory farms earlier. And if you ask, what should we do about factory farms? But you put on the caveat that we need to have access to infinite quantities of cheap and diseased meat, That's a different question than if you ask, my loyalty is to pigs and chickens and cows, and what do we do about factory farms? The answer becomes a lot easier. Switch this around. If coho salmon could take on human manifestation, how long would the dams on the Klamath River last? If Delta smelt could take on human manifestation, how long would the pumps on the Sacramento River last? Because that's how we have to start thinking. There's the cliche of who speaks for wolf. Who speaks for wolf? Who speaks for grizzly bear? Who speaks for Delta smelt? And
right. I'm trying to put everything through an eco filter. What are we talking about? How does that affect nature? And everything goes through that filter before I consider anything else, economy, civilization, anything like that. It's like, how is that going to affect nature?
right,
Right?
right.
That's the right way to think about it.
So did you say we had one more and then we're done?
Yeah, it's just me. Okay, so this morning, oddly enough, on the news, they were talking about this new solar technology that can heat up metals enough to melt them. It can um, have enough energy to make cement. And they're talking about this saving the climate. And all I can think of is, oh my God, this is going to eat nature faster. This is just going to facilitate eating nature faster if we have the ability to use solar to eat nature faster. So what are your thoughts on, did you hear about that, and what are your thoughts on that concept?
I didn't hear about that specific one, but I know about the ones that heat up the molten salt, and that's just an energy storage device, and those those particular ones. I mean, first off, you're absolutely right, and that's just another means to consume the planet faster. Second, those facilities are themselves really horrifying in that um, they vaporize, they burn the wings off birds who fly over them. And what happens is insects are attracted to the light, and then insectivorous birds follow them and get their wings burned off, and predatory birds follow them and get their wings burned off. Um, that's excluding all the stuff we talked about earlier with every step of the way requires mining. And we talked about what happens with mining earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, what are you going to use it for?
Well, they'd probably take the metal that's already there to melt it down if they can melt metal with it. So I'm thinking, okay,
They have to have mirrors. They've got to have power lines. They've got to
yeah,
have roads to the place. I mean,
and battery systems, lithium, which we're already in a war with Bolivia to a coup over
right.
Bolivia to steal the lithium so that we can continue the system that's
The
broken.
problem is that, and I'm sorry if this is too mathematical for people, but the problem is we're solving for the wrong variable.
You're the math wizard. I forget that.
What do all the so-called solutions to global warming have in common? What they all have in common is they take industrial capitalism as a given, and the world is having to conform to industrial capitalism. That's backwards, because without a world, you don't have any social system whatsoever. The world must be primary. And what should we, the variable that we should be solving for is how do we actually help the planet? And people talk about, oh, we're going to save the planet by putting in another industrial solar harvesting facility. I'm sorry, how does that help Delta smelt? How does that help coho salmon? How does it help desert tortoises?
Right. I was going to say the desert tortoises. Yes.
I mean, with some of these facilities, they put up chain link fences around them. They take desert tortoises out of them, and they also bury a lot of them alive underground. And then the desert tortoises try to go home, and they walk back and forth outside the chain link fence until they die of heat.
Yeah. And now the Endangered Species Act, they've made it so there's economical considerations of whether we should or should not place them on the endangered species list.
So let's take this back to violence for just one sentence, which is I think I think that the most final and most horrific act of violence that one can commit is to drive a species extinct.
Absolutely. I mean, if someone did that to humans, they would certainly consider that violent. I mean, when they did it to the Jewish people, they certainly considered that violence. So any genocide is an act of violence, and we're doing that to all other species on the planet. And eventually we're going to do it to ourselves.
Right.
And this is where we're at. So,
I agree.
yeah. God, I loved having you on, Derrick. And definitely let's work out a time. Probably, I don't know. I don't know. It's holidays, so it's gonna be hard. Not that I care. I mean, we always end up on the holidays. It's the day before Thanksgiving. So and the last time it was what, Labor Day or something. I don't remember. It was a holiday, um, which is fine with me. But let's work on a Q&A. So I want everybody who wants to ask Derrick a question that didn't get it in, please put it in the comments and I'll compile a list so we have a head start, and we'll be open to more questions later. But let's get a head start on that. And please, I know later on it's, you think of, oh, I should have asked this. So do that in the comments after the show so I can document them and hold them for next time I have Derrick on, because that sounds great. Just to have a Q&A, because he can talk forever on one question because he is brilliant. I'm sorry, he's one of my very favorite people in the world. I could talk to him forever and ever and ever, but I don't want to keep you all night. Thank you so much, Derrick.
Thank you.
If you want to hang out for a second, I just got to say hi to a couple people. Andre, thank you for coming. Torstein, Osama, Human, Pink Barrio, thank you for coming. Zox, uh, Beatrix, Kid Video, new person, thank you. Chris Foster made it, yay. Sandy, hello, thank you for coming. Love you, Sandy. Jean, Mr. Happy, a new person. Thank you, Mr. Happy. Hopefully you were nice this time, because last time you were not so nice. Let's see. Who else? Who else? Val. Love you, Val, so much. We'll talk to you soon. Um, Poetry Yoga Radical Eco Feminist. Thank you for coming. So she was really excited about a Q&A. Blake TV. Thank you for coming. Did I miss anybody? I'm sure I missed people. I'm sorry if I missed you guys, but we've gone long enough. I don't want to keep Derrick too much longer. Thank you so much. Let's head out and just talk to me 1 second before we're done, Derrick. After the ending video we do. Have a good night, guys. Love you all, and we'll see you Monday.